And that's, you know, I often perceive that there are moments like that politically. Yes, the Middle East was one that we might be going through. You know, you saw just before the Berlin Wall fell, everyone thought that it was impossible. Why? I mean, it's not that people suddenly received a lot of new information. Rather, what the information that they received is that a large majority of people had the same beliefs that they had, and people became sure of that. And then you have a sudden switch, a sudden state change, and then you have a revolution. So I often feel that we're on the edge of that, and that alternative ways of people becoming aware of what their beliefs are, what each other's beliefs are, is something that introduces that truly democratic shift. And I've often lambasted bloggers as people who just want to demonstrate peer value conformity and who don't actually do any original news, don't do any original work. When we release original documentation on many things, although the situation is very interestingly improving, often we find that all these left-wing bloggers do not descend on a fresh cable from Panama, revealing, as it did today, that the United States has declared the right to board 1/3 of all ships in the world without any justification. They do not descend on that. Rather, they read the front page of the New York Times and go, I disagree, or I agree in my categories. And that is something that is sort of that hypocrisy of saying that you care about a situation, but not actually doing the work is something that has angered me. But it does serve an important function. The function that it serves is the function of the square. It is to show the number of voices that are lining up on one side or another.
Before you respond, I just wanted to ask, since you talked about what you released today, you also have just sued MasterCard and Visa. Can you explain this weekend why you did that?
Well, you know, when Daniel Ellsberg released the Pentagon Papers, actually I spoke to Daniel Ellsberg last night, told me an incredible story about that, but did you know the New York Times had 1,000 pages of the Pentagon Papers 1 month before Daniel Ellsberg gave the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times? Fresh news. Amazing stuff. Yeah, I'll leave that aside. Sorry, what was the question? Oh yes, the Muscat. So when Daniel Ellsberg released the Pentagon Papers, did they suddenly change things? Actually, Nixon was re-elected after Daniel Ellsberg released the Pentagon Papers. The Vietnam War didn't stop. The information was very important in all sorts of ways, and its importance over time was very important. The most important thing to come out of the Pentagon Papers was the reaction to the Pentagon Papers, because the Pentagon Papers described a situation in the past, what the past was like, but the reaction to the Pentagon Papers described what was going on right now. And it showed a tremendous overreach by the Nixon administration, various attempts to cover things up. And actually, the New York Times really probably wouldn't have published the Pentagon Papers unless they thought it was going to be published anyway, which they did. It was scheduled to be published in 4 months' time in a book. Very, very interesting. So on December 6th last year, Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, the Bank of America, Western Union, all ganged up together to engage in an economic blockade against WikiLeaks. And that economic blockade has continued since that point. So it's over 6 months now. We have been suffering from an extrajudicial economic blockade that has occurred without any process whatsoever. In fact, the only 2 formal investigations into this, one was on January 13 last year by Timothy C. Geithner, the Secretary of the Treasury, who found that there was no lawful excuse to conduct an economic blockade against WikiLeaks. And the other was by a Visa subsidiary who was handling our European payments, Teller, who found that we were not in breach of any of Visa's bylines or regulations. Those are the only two formal inquiries. And yet, the blockade continues. It's an extraordinary thing that we have seen that Visa, MasterCard, Western Union, and so on are instruments of US foreign policy, but instruments of not US as in a state operating under law's foreign policy, but rather instruments of Washington's patronage network policy. So there was no due process at all. And so over the past few months, we have a number of cases on, so we've been a bit distracted, but over the last few months we have built up a case against Visa and MasterCard under European law. And Visa and MasterCard together own about 95% of the credit card payment industry in Europe, and therefore they have a sort of market dominance, and that means under European law they cannot engage in certain actions that to unfairly remove people from the market.
Speaking of other legal cases, I just wanted to ask you about what you face next week, the extradition case on July 12th. The Nation magazine has done two pieces. One is forthcoming. And they quote your new lawyer, Gareth Pierce, who is very well known for representing prisoners at Guantanamo, a renowned human rights attorney. And Tom Hayden, who writes the piece, interviewed many people in Sweden and the United States and sort of talks about a feeling in Sweden of an attack very much represented by your past lawyers on the Swedish justice system and on the integrity of the women in Sweden. And he quotes Gareth Pierce saying that
our lawyers never attacked any integrity of women.
Well, he quotes Gareth Pierce saying the history of this case is as unfortunate as it is possible to imagine. Each of the human beings involved deserves respect and consideration. And I just wanted to ask if you are seeing this as a change of approach with your legal team in dealing with your possible extradition to Sweden.
Possibly. I mean, the situation, what has happened to Europe and what has happened to Sweden is fascinating. I mean, it's something that I have come to learn because I've been embroiled in it. But it is intellectually extraordinary. So we see, for example, that the European Union introduced an arrest warrant system. And that arrest warrant system to extradite from one state of the EU to another state of the EU was put in place in response to 9/11 to extradite terrorists, to have fast extradition of terrorists. And it introduced this concept, or rather recycled a European Union concept of mutual recognition. This is sort of a very feel-good phrase that one state in the EU mutually recognises another state in the EU, and that sunk down into mutual recognition between one court in the EU to another court in the EU. But actually what it seems to be talking about, if you think about it, given the reality that 3 people a day are extradited from this country to the rest of Europe, is a mutual recognition of the elite in each country in the EU. It is a method of being at peace. So the elite in each country in the EU has, if you like, made literally a treaty with each other to recognize each other and to not complain about the behavior. Now, you might say that, well, okay, we have justice systems in the EU in various countries. Yes, they vary in all sorts of ways. Some are better, some are worse, depending on your value system. But we've sunk so low that it's not even like that anymore. The European arrest warrant talks about the mutual recognition of judicial authorities, so courts. But it has permitted each country to define what they call a judicial authority. And Sweden has chosen to call policemen and prosecutors judicial authorities. And the whole basis of this term being used in the original introduction of European arrest warrant was that you would keep the executive separated from the judicial system, that it was meant to be a natural and neutral party who would request extradition, and it's not. So there are many things like this that are going on in that case. I haven't been charged. So is it right to extradite someone to a state where they do not speak the language, where they do not have family, they do not know the lawyers, they do not know the legal system, if you don't even have enough evidence to charge them? You won't even come over, as we have offered many times, to speak to the people concerned. So previous complaints about these sort of problems have led to some inquiries in Sweden. For instance, the biggest Swedish law magazine that goes out to all the lawyers had a survey on this, and 1/3 of the lawyers responding said that yes, that these complaints about the Swedish judicial system, they truly are a problem. On the other hand, it has also engendered a situation where the Swedish Prime Minister and the Swedish Justice Minister have personally attacked me and said, the Swedish Prime Minister said that I had been charged to the Swedish public when I hadn't been. So it is a delicate situation. The Sweden we have now is not the Sweden of Olof Palme in the 1970s. Sweden recently passed a bill to send Marines into Libya. It was the 5th country out to send fighter jets into Libya. This is a different dynamic that has happened now, and we have to be careful dealing with it. So it's one thing to sort of be considerate of differences in the way various justice systems are administered, but it's another to tolerate any difference. And I don't think any difference should be tolerated in the EU. You know, what is it that prevents the justice systems of EU states from fundamentally collapsing and decaying? We say there's mutual recognition. It's mutual recognition between the UK and Romania. And what if the Romanian justice system collapses more and more and more? Who's going to account for that? Who's going to scrutinise it? Is it going to be some bureaucrats in the EC that are going to scrutinise the Romanian justice system? No. The only sustainable approach to scrutinising the justice systems of the EU is the extradition process. So it is extradition lawyers and defendants who have the highest motivation to scrutinise the quality of justice in the state that they are being extradited to. And that's a healthy system that permits outside scrutiny and so can stop European states from decaying. But the European arrest warrant system removes that possibility. It's not open to us to look at any of the facts in the case, in the extradition at all. That is completely removed. All we're arguing about is whether the 2-page request that was filled out, which literally has a box ticked rape, is a valid document.